about 11:30 that night, there was a burst of automatic gunfire. And I heard that initial blast of gunfire, and it was my dad being killed. Little did I know at the time. And the gunfire continued all night, raged all night, just constant. And because it was such a lovely day and it was so warm, I was still out in the street sort of playing, waiting on my dad coming home. And the women were standing talking, waiting on their husbands coming back from a night out at the bar. And when the gunfire started, I was pulled into a neighbour's house. And I was sitting on a seat with my eyes closed, and people were coming and going. And as they were coming and going, I could hear hushed whispers. Does he know? It's awful, it's terrible. Has anybody told him? All in hushed whispers. I think they thought I was asleep because I was sitting with my eyes closed. And I remember getting up and saying, "What haven't you told me? What's terrible?" And running out of the house, and running up the street, and still see the tracer bullets as I was running up the street, gonna run in the line of the gunfire. And my friend's dad stepped out and he grabbed me. And I think I was crying and I was saying, "Where's my daddy? Where's my daddy?" I must have sensed that something was wrong or picked up something in the home. And he said to me, "Billy, your daddy's not coming home, your daddy's dead." And I remember saying, "Well, perhaps it's God's will." And he took me by the shoulders. I was 12. He took me by the shoulders and he literally started to shake me. And he said, "You listen here. There is no God. This has nothing to do with God." And he used an expletive. And he said, "It's those across the road," referring to the Roman Catholic community. "It's those across the road. Never you forget that." And I guess, Marcus, from that moment on, I didn't forget it.
Why did they kill him? I mean, you weren't a politically motivated family.
Well, I say the troubles had sort of started and communities were starting to polarize. And the folks who opened up and shot my dad on the other side of the road knew that whoever they killed on the other side of the road was the enemy, as they perceived the enemy. So it was just a totally random shooting.
How did it affect your family?
Boy, really from that moment on when he said there is no God, God became an irrelevance. If there was, in my own life, if there was a God, he could have stopped my dad being killed. If there was an all-powerful God, he could have intervened, but he didn't. So either there isn't an all-powerful God, or else there is no God. Or, if there is a God, maybe he's just wound this world up, this universe up, and taken himself off, and he's not interested. So and it didn't go back to church, it didn't go back to Sunday school or any little children's meetings. And my family became increasingly bitter. I know that, my family don't have a monopoly on violence. Sadly, many families have been touched as a result of the madness that emanated from Ireland during those 3 decades. And not every family reacted the way my family reacted. But certainly we reacted with hate. And we hear a lot today, the buzzwords today are radicalization and what sort of contributes to a radicalization process. Those buzzwords weren't used back then, but certainly the concept was there. So what feeds that radicalization? Well, when you hear about your dad being murdered, sows seeds of hatred and bitterness.
Your mother, how did it affect her?
She was devastated, It just, I said that I can remember my mum singing as a boy when She was cleaning the house after my dad was killed. She stopped singing. She said she had nothing to sing about. She was 3 months pregnant when my dad was killed, and 6 months later to the day my kid brother was born. And she often said, were it not for the fact that she had a little baby to look after, she would have got involved in terrorism. So it was her hate. And I can still remember my brother, just as a little boy, running in off the street and asking what a daddy was. How come his friends had a daddy to talk about and he hadn't? Where was his daddy? And to see my mum break down in tears, trying to explain why there's no father figure in the home, sows seeds of hatred and bitterness to a greater degree and a greater extent, shows that radicalization process, and I swore that somehow, someday, I would get my own back, I would get revenge. And that hate, that bitterness, that insatiable longing for revenge, it's like a cancer that just eats away. And yeah, the whole family was affected by that. And I said, that's how our family reacted. Not every family reacted.
So your mother would have joined the paramilitaries if you didn't have a kid to look after. You did end up joining a group. Tell us how that came about. So you were, 16 at the time?
16. And really by this time, as the troubles are starting to take hold, certainly the part of Belfast where I came from, and the same applied to, I think, young lads on the Republican side. It was expected of young lads to be involved to some degree. But I didn't want to get involved just to be part of the gang or part of the in crowd. I wanted to get involved because of what had happened to my dad. And I'm not saying that justifies my actions, okay? But certainly I felt the paramilitaries would have given me the opportunity to exact revenge. And, you have bars around the area, public houses where people go and have a drink. Well, in Belfast, everybody knew what particular, organisation was affiliated to a particular bar. So you just simply turn up at the bar and volunteer your services. And that's what happened.
Is it like sort of joining a scout group or something? So
Only a bit more serious.
But they have meetings, and what would you do?
Yeah.
You'd gather in some secret location, and what goes on?
Well, there's nothing particularly secretive about a bar. You just turn up. And I remember the night I joined. There were 3 of us joined that night together. And went into the bar, and the commander of this little unit came up to us and he said, what do you want to do? And I remember saying to him, well, look, I just want to kill people. Well, not kill people, kill Republicans. And he laughed and he made a gesture with his hand, behind him. And he said, there's about 60 in front of you. These other young lads sitting around all the tables in this bar. And that's what frustrated me when I offered my services that night. The fact that I was in a queue and I would have to wait my turn before I could exact my revenge.
How long did it take until you got your turn, as you put it?
Okay, so on the 19th of February 76, so just about 18 months after I joined, it was part of myself and another fella went out and part of an execution that took place.
Yeah. Just how does that happen? So the commander sort of says to you, here's a guy, here's an address, go and kill him? Is that how it happens? Or?
Yeah, it's as cold as that. Yeah, well, it was October 75, I was initially approached and asked if I would be willing to shoot an IRA man. Of course I would. That's why I'm in the organisation. And it was myself and my friend who had joined the organisation with that night. And it was on, the shooting was on. And October 75, but then all of a sudden, it was pulled. Didn't know why. But then in February 76, was approached again and said, right, this shooting's on. Are you still up for it? Yes. And they said, we need to clarify something. It's not an IRA man. It's actually one of our own members. So he's a fellow UVF man. We believe he's an informant, giving information to the police. And everybody in the organisation knows if you're informing, it's an immediate death sentence. So if this guy was informing, then, the rules are rules. So, yeah.
Did you know the man?
No. Mm-hmm. But my wee mate who was going to do the shooting with us, he said to us, we only need one of you. Somebody else from another unit's going to do the shooting. And we started to argue who was going to do this shooting. And the sort of commander of the organisation, he pulled a coin out of his pocket and he tossed it in the air and he said, right, call. And I called heads, and it was heads. He says, right, you get to do the shooting.
Had you ever used a gun before? Or had you just been meeting in the bar
just
with
in,
these guys?
Just in the Army cadets and that.
Uh-huh.
Done it. But, so the shooting was back on, and the 19th of February, 76, that morning, met up with the accomplice. The accomplice picked up her guns, went to a place where we knew that this man would be turning up to go to his work, and very coldly, callously, brutally, took the life of another human being. There was no, at the time, there was no twinge of conscience, no sense of shame. It was just cold and brutal and bloody.
So this was what, you rang his doorbell? He came?
He came. He was coming for work. We knew where he was going to park his car. Mm-hmm. It was in a derelict street. He parked his car behind the premises where he worked.
And how far away? And was this like point blank range? Or?
Just as close as you are, Marcus.
Yeah, yeah. But you didn't feel any remorse about what you'd done?
No. If there was anything at the time, there was a sense of, of proving myself, and now I'm going to go on a killing spree. Nothing's going to hold me back. That's how I was thinking at the time.
Yeah. I mean, did you feel like you were a soldier at war?
Yeah, it's pathetic to think that. When you think of, our own armed services and what they do when they go to war, and but that's how I thought at the time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly like that.
Now, it didn't take too long before the long arm of the law caught up with you. How long was it before you
Mercifully, looking back, yes, it was 2 weeks later, on the 8th of March, 76, I was arrested. I actually thought I was arrested for hijackings that had taken place that weekend, because nobody saw us doing the shooting. Well, obviously God saw us, but from a human perspective, we were clean away as far as I was concerned. But I remember the two detectives coming into the interview room and throwing their files on the table and saying, where were you on the 19th of February? How do they know about the 19th of February,
How did they know?
Yeah, that's right. How did they know? Well, it came out of court that somebody informed on us. Uh-huh. Okay. So, but they said about this man had been shot dead, and he's this man's dad is absolutely devastated because back in October 75, when the shooting was supposed to be take place, the man had just buried his wife in October 75. She died suddenly. That's why the shooting was pulled in October, because his mum had died. Mm-hmm. And now the police were saying, the man's absolutely devastated. Now he's burying his son. And they practically told us, we've got a few things wrong, but, the whole sort of hit, So somebody informed on us.
Did your mother know what you'd done?
No. She knew that I was involved, but I think because I was young, I was 16, 17, I think she thought I was no more than a runner or somebody that would stand on the corner of a street and make sure there's no police about while the ones who were in it more deeply than I was, get on with their dirty deeds. But it wasn't until the charges were read out in court that my family actually realised just how deeply it was involved. Yeah.
So you remember the trial then? How did that go down? And what was your sort of attitude to things?
Yeah. See, when I was arrested and taken to the Maze prison, getting arrested wasn't a big shock to my system. Okay, the type of activity I was involved in, I was either going to get arrested and end up in prison for a very long time, or else I was going to end up dead. They were the only two scenarios, the type of activities I was involved in. So I ended up in prison, okay. There was an element of pride. I say there's no shame. There was no remorse or anything. There was no stigma attached to going into prison. And so I was expecting that, okay? That wasn't a shock to my system. You know what was a shock to my system? The very first order given to myself by the paramilitary commanders. I was told that in prison I would encounter members of the Republican movement, the enemy. And any time I run into them, I hadn't to say anything that would agitate them or cause them to react violently to me. And I was assured that under no circumstances that would they say anything to me that would cause me to react violently to them. And that was a shock to my system. The fact that these people who were at each other's throats on the outside had actually thrashed out an agreement in prison. And they were coexisting with each other. I
Can we just
wasn't
go
expecting that.
back a bit to the trial then? So the trial, that would have been a shock for your family. That's when they first knew what was going on.
Yeah, that's when it was on remand, when I first went in, okay.
I see.
So I'm just in on remand. The trial comes a year later, okay.
I see. Yeah.
All right. So that was my first experience of prison. The fact that these people had come to an agreement in prison and they were coexisting. So I wasn't expecting that. But then the trial on the 12th of May, 1977, I was found guilty. I was too young to be given a life sentence, so I was detained under the Secretary of State's pleasure. Obviously my family were devastated that I was going into prison for such a long time. But, I arrogantly, along with my co-accused, practically laughed in the judge's face. Such was my contempt, of man's law, man's justice. That's how I'm feeling at the time.
So the Maze prison then, tell us a bit about that. So it was the biggest prison in Europe at the time, and it was just for paramilitaries, was it?
Yeah, mainly. But it was open in 1971 as an internment camp, and then as the troubles escalated, just held people who were arrested for terrorist-related crimes. So it was like a dustbin of evil.
Yeah. Give average day in the Maze, what would you do? How long are you in your cell for, and what do you get up to?
Yeah. Average day in the H blocks. The more you do, the quicker time goes. Okay, so if you can get something to do to get through the day, it helps. People that vegetate, that just lay in their beds all day, and it drag for them. So when I went into prison, I started, making use of the education facilities, and I started to do a degree and things like that. So that sort of kept things going, and the day was quick. The food was horrible, but see, after you were there for about 3 years, you thought it was great. So yeah, the day could drag if you let it drag, but if you kept yourself busy doing things.
And you, the sort of paramilitary training carried on within the Maze, is that how it
that
worked?
was when I was prior to the sentence. That's when I first went in. Yeah, it was nuts, like. Because we used to have sort of, I was placed in a compound that solely held members of the organisation I was affiliated with. So we used to have, bomb making classes in those compounds. Now, we didn't have the wherewithal to make the bombs, but the guys who were knowledgeable in explosives, they would bring you in and sort of would use the substitute material and say, right, this is how you set the bomb and everything up. So all that was taking place in the maze,
Now, several things started to come together over time, which got you thinking about God and the big questions of life. One was a fellow inmate. Tell us about him. So, Peter.
Yeah, after I was sentenced and taken to the H blocks. Now, if any of you know about the history of the province, emanating from the H blocks in the 70s and 80s, you have what they called was a blanket protest where Republican prisoners sat naked in their cells with just a blanket around them because they were wanting political status. So what I enjoyed, that was the right word to use, what I had when I was on remand, they wanted that reinstated again. Okay, so they were protesting to get it. They sat naked in their cells, and then they escalated that to the dirty protests where they smeared their excrement on the cell walls, and then the hunger strike. Now, if you didn't remember the other two, some of you will remember the hunger strike, where 10 Republican hunger strikers died. So that's where I ended up after I was sentenced in the H blocks. And a couple of weeks after I was sentenced, a fellow called Peter Thompson arrived in the H blocks. We were on remand together, so I knew Peter well. But he landed in the H blocks carrying a Bible and talking about Jesus, which I thought was really convenient because he had just got a life sentence and he wants to get out of prison early. How's he going to get out of prison early? Well, show the authorities he's a good guy. Instead of carrying a bomb, he's now carrying a Bible. And so, as far as I was concerned, Peter was a hypocrite. He was a phony. He couldn't face up to the pressures of the penal system, having been given a life sentence. He needed a crutch to lean on. Christianity, religion, is a convenient crutch. So Peter, when he arrived in the H block, decided that he was going to be the block barber. Now, Peter had never cut anybody's hair in his life, but he said, I'm going to be the block barber. And the reason he said that was because being the block barber, he could get round each of the four wings, okay? And he thought this would be a great way to evangelize. And so when you needed a haircut, you had to send for Peter. And I remember I used to do this regular, so you'd be sitting getting your hair cut, and he would get the scissors and he'd put them on the side of your neck. And he would be applying some pressure, and he would say, right, just another little bit of pressure and I'm into your jugular. And he says, you're lying there in a pool of blood, and before they get a medic down to this wing to stem the flow of blood, you're dead and you're in hell because you're not a Christian. What about that for evangelism? Yeah. And Peter did that regular, Are there any hairdressers here? Try that tomorrow morning. But Peter...
So was that just a negative impact on you in terms of Christian witness, or was there anything in that which...
I just thought he was nuts.
He was nuts, okay. And then you started to get some strange envelopes as well?
Yes. Now, this is bizarre, but this is what happened. It was around about 1978. Started to receive magazines from New Zealand. Now, to this day, I don't know, my family do not know anybody in New Zealand. But it was a religious magazine. I can only open one of these. And I caught the name of Jesus in the corner, and I put it back inside the envelope, curled it up in a ball, and threw it in the waste paper bin. No time for God or religion. And 6 or 8 weeks later, another one of these magazines, in a sort of long brown envelope. Postmarked New Zealand, stamped New Zealand. It was handwritten, and there was only one mistake on the envelope. My prison number was 691. These folks had written G91. That was the only mistake. But it was addressed to myself in H Block 7 of the Maze Prison. They kept coming. I know what's inside it. It's a religious magazine, into the bin. Peter Thompson still running about the place, with his novel approach to evangelism. And I thought, well, Peter could make use of these magazines. And I started to divert them to him. As soon as the magazines reached my cell, I would call the prison officer back and say, give that to Peter Thompson. he's into this religious stuff. And August of 1980, I went out to the medical room one night for a headache tablet. I used to take terrible migraine headaches. I felt one of these headaches coming on. I went out to the medical room, and Peter was in the medical room. And I just happened to say to him, Peter, I hope you're getting the magazines I'm sending over. I don't know who's sending them, but you're quite welcome to them. And even before Peter could answer, the medical officer interrupted. And he said, oh, do you not think it's God who's sending you these magazines? And honestly, I'd never heard anything as stupid in my life. Like, God sending magazines from New Zealand to the Maze prison. And I remember looking at this medical officer, Joe Martin. He became a good friend after it. I remember looking at him and saying, don't believe in God. I'm skeptical. And usually if I'd have said to the likes of Peter Thompson, a Christian prisoner who's professing faith, or a Christian prison officer, I'm skeptical about God, I don't believe, they would always come back at me with Psalm 14 verse 1 or Psalm 53 verse 1, exact same verses. The fool has said in his heart there is no God. So I was waiting on this medical officer saying, oh, you're a fool. And then I was going to throw him a line of argument and get offside. And I remember he looked at me and he said, oh, you're skeptical about God. And I said, yeah, that's right. He's going to call me a fool because you can read these Christians like a book. You don't believe God exists. You're skeptical. And I said, yeah, that's right. He said, well, I want to tell you something, kid. Regardless of whether you believe in God or not, doesn't take away the fact that there is a God. Nor does it take away the fact that if you die in the state that you're in at the moment, you're going straight to hell. And once you get there, kid, you will not be skeptical anymore. He says, in fact, you will be a believer because everybody in that place believes. And the tragedy of it is this, that once you get there, there's no way out. There's no release date in hell. You're there forever. I couldn't hit him with a line of argument for you're a fool. He wrong-footed me. I wasn't expecting that response. And I got my headache tablets and I turned and hightailed it out of that medical room. And what I can't give an adequate explanation for, even up to the present day, is that those magazines that had been coming on a regular basis every 6 or 8 weeks since about 1978, never received another one after that conversation in the medical room. It's as bizarre as that, it's as freaky as that, but that's how it happened. And I started, if there's a heaven and a hell, I started thinking about it. If there's a heaven and a hell, if there is. Well, there's no argument. Okay, I know where I'm going, but is there a heaven and a hell? Is there a God? What religion's right? Here I was encountering these Christians in this prison, and do you know what's really annoying about them is their dogmatism. Such crass arrogance on their part. Their Bible is the only Bible. Their way is the only way. Nobody else gets a look in. And I started to ask all sorts of questions, but never really happy getting the question answered.
And then you had a visitor, a little retired school teacher, who, tell us about that. So she would come regularly to see you, would she?
Well, Gladys would come up to the prison regular. Usually I tried to keep away from her because I had little time for religion. Or any talk about the Bible or Jesus. She was a remarkable wee character. Can I go off on a tangent for 2 minutes? Yep. She stood about so high. She taught mathematics in Methodist College, Belfast. In every, when there was a new regiment coming into the province, Gladys would go up to RAF Aldergrove and meet them and give them little gospel tracts as they come off the plane. If there was a soldier injured and taken to Musgrave Park Military Hospital, she would visit them right to their parents. Same with policemen. She was remarkable, And she came down to my cell this Christmas Eve night, Christmas Eve 1980. And after a bit of formal conversation, she simply lifted down the Bible. She opened it up at Luke chapter 23, and she began to read the story of the crucifixion. And a superscription also was written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. This is the King of the Jews. And one of the thieves which was hanged railed on him, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other answering rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, seeing we are in the same condemnation, and we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong, he's innocent." And he said unto Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." She stopped at that 42nd verse, began to explain what Jesus Christ must have looked like on the cross, and as she was explaining that, for the very first time in my life, I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Never felt guilty before. But as she read that and then explained what Jesus must have looked like on the cross, as that thief had said, this man is innocent, I realized that Jesus Christ was innocent. He didn't know any of the vileness that characterized my life, any of the wretchedness or the evil that characterized my life. He was sinless. And I felt guilty. And also, Mark, as I realized that on the cross that Jesus Christ was bearing my punishment, if you like. You know, that as the medical officer said, if I died in the state that I was in, I was going to hell, and that was right. And I finally realized that my actions were wrong. There was no justification. Now, if you had met me in the Maze prison prior to this and said, "Were you justified?" See, in a warped way, I would have justified or attempted to justify my actions. And you'd have walked away thinking, that guy's got a screw loose. How can you justify murder? But I would have tenaciously attempted to justify my actions. So that night when I came face to face with the cross of Christ, no justification, I was guilty.
And you did something about it that night?
Yeah. I asked that woman, I realized that Jesus Christ was taking my punishment. It was so clear that's why Jesus Christ was dying on the cross. He was dying for sinners, and I was a sinner. And I asked that woman, how do you become a Christian? She said, it's as simple as ABC. Accept Jesus Christ died for you, believe it, and then go and confess it to others. Accept it and believe it, yeah. Confess it to others. That's a sticking point. Because I knew what I thought about Peter Thompson. And I knew what other people thought about people who professed to be Christians in prison. But, she left me with several portions of Scripture. I only ever remember one of them. All that the Father gives to me will come to me, and him who comes to me I will never turn away. And that night, Christmas Eve 1980, I got down on my knees in the cell. This was after the woman had left. An hour or so later, and I repented of my sin. And I threw a wasted life before God. And there was no claps of thunder or funny mystical experience. There was no flashes of lightning. And it was a simple prayer of faith. If there was anything subjective, it was I felt clean after I said that prayer. And that was the only subjective thing. I felt a cleanness. And also, I learned that God's not in the business of giving out crutches. I realized that night He gave me a new life. As Jesus says to Nicodemus in John 3, you need to be born again. And it was like a new birth. It was a new birth.
And the next day then, the confessing bit,
Christmas,
did you tell
Christmas
everyone?
Day. Yeah, how am I going to get around this, telling people I'm a Christian? Well, see, in the cell next door to me, there's a guy called Michael McGee. And this sounds, dead sexist these days, but we called him Shirley McGee, because he was a gossip. All these women gossip all the time. That was why we called Michael Shirley, because he was a gossip. And I knew that if I told Michael that I was a Christian, he would tell everybody else. And so when the prison officer opened the cell door that Christmas morning. I followed him next door when he was opening up Shirley McGee's cell. And I shouted, "And I became a Christian last night," and run back into my cell. And true to form, Shirley must have followed the prison officer up and down the whole wing and told everybody for me.
Did you get much stick?
I did. Some people want to shake you by the throat, and others want to shake you by the hand, you know. But yeah, you get a lot of stick. But I knew something real had happened the night before. And I know it was a bit of a cop-out now, getting somebody else to tell people I was a Christian, like, but it got me over that first hurdle.
You told your family?
Yeah. Wrote out to family and friends. You see, during the sort of the period from sort of 76 up to sort of mid-80s, I was into sort of communism in a big way. And I thought Marxism held the answer to Ireland's problems. See, after I became a Christian, my sister said, "Well, anything's better than communism." That was my older sister's response.
And your mum?
My mum. Right. See, just last week I found some of the letters that she had written at that time. We were doing a clear out last week, you know, and found the letters. The first letter I got from her, she said, "I'm really pleased you're a Christian. You know, it's a hard life, but I'm really pleased for you." Okay? So I must have written back saying to her, you know, about, you know, God's love and God's mercy and God's grace, because in that letter, as I read through it, she's still talking about, you know, what the IRA had done to my dad. And there was this bitterness in the letter. And I said, "Look, you know, don't be bitter. Don't be angry." And then she'd written this other letter back to me, and the prison authorities weren't going to give it to me. And in it, she was saying, how could I talk to her about a God of love? How could I talk to her about a God of forgiveness? Had I forgotten what had happened to my dad? And obviously I hadn't. But where was this great God of love, this great God of forgiveness? And that your dad was gone down in the street like a dog. And she begins to explain how she met my dad after he came out of the army in the Second World War. And, you know, all their plans and their hopes and their dreams for the future. And how it was all taken from us as a result of these IRA scum. She'd underlined it. And it was so full of hate, and pain, bitterness. And I sat down and I wrote her a letter based in Romans 12:19. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay." Trying to explain to her that part of my problem, my family's problem, was that we thought vengeance belonged to us, that we had the right to go out and exact revenge. Vengeance belongs to God. And I wrote a covering letter to my younger sister who's professing faith. And I said, "You go down and get my mum and get her to church with you." And then it was about 2 weeks later, and I was reading this letter last week. She says, "I've got wonderful news for you. Tonight at church, I became a Christian." And she says, "I can honestly say all the hate and the bitterness is gone, and I forgive your dad's killers." And I saw a mountain move when my mum was saved, you know, a mountain of hatred and bitterness.
What would you say to someone who says, "Well, it just seems too easy. You do something like what you've done,
Yeah.
You pray a prayer and it's all forgiven. It just seems a bit too convenient and easy."
Yeah. You know, salvation is easy in the sense that whoever comes on to Jesus and confesses their sins, he will never turn away. You know, that verse that the woman left with me. But hey, if you're thinking like that, you're thinking from the wrong perspective, because the cost of forgiveness, Jesus Christ had to die and shed his blood for me to be forgiven. That wasn't easy. In the Garden of Gethsemane, even before he gets to the cross, he is wrestling with what's ahead of him. And he's saying, "Father, if there is any other way other than what's before me, tell me." And nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. And he had to go to the cross. Look, see, for me to sit here tonight and tell you that I'm forgiven, it was easy for me in the cell, if you like, to say, yes, I'm sorry for what I've done before God, but it was costly for him.
And how was the Billy who came out of prison when you were released? How was he different to the Billy who went into prison? What would we have noticed?
It's different as black as the white, And, just in relation to my mum, before I move on to that, see, after she became a Christian, she started singing again. God put the song back into her life. And that's what God does. The God we're sharing with you this evening is a God who moves into broken lives and starts to put them back together again. He's the God who picks people up and gives them meaning to their life, gives vitality to life. And some, years ago, just after I was married, my wife was saying, what sort of way were you thinking when you were in the paramilitary group? And I remember starting to tell her, what way I was thinking, what the mindset was. And it only started telling her, it was only about 2 minutes into the conversation, and she put her hand up like that. She said, stop right there. Don't go any further. Because if you go any further on the basis of what you started telling me, she says, I'll end up hating you because I do not know that monster. And she's never asked me since, And yes, I regret my past. The proverbial, I wish I could turn the clock back. Boy, do I wish I could turn the clock back. I share what I have done to a group like yourselves because I want you to see that God can change a life, that God can graciously turn a life around. I don't want to glory in the past because there's no glory in that past. There's nothing but shame and regret. But the Billy that came out of prison, I don't recognize the Billy that went in. So I don't. That Billy's dead.
Maybe just a final question because our time is gone, but last year was the funeral of Billy McCurrie, who was the commander of the IRA unit that shot your dad. Presumably that must have been a very, very painful funeral for you to witness as they were burying this guy as some hero. How did you process that as a Christian now?
Yeah, I'm a Christian. I'm a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ. I don't hold any hatred or bitterness in my heart towards Billy McCurrie. He was the commander of the IRA that night that was operating when my dad was killed. He knew that if he was not one of the actual killers, he certainly knew the men who did kill my dad, and would never divulge that, wouldn't talk to the police about that. So yeah, it was difficult knowing that one of the people responsible for my dad's death was never arrested or questioned by the police. Because I'm a Christian doesn't mean that I set justice to the side, People still want justice. And it was sad that he was eulogized as a Republican hero. The Republican movement per se have never really apologized or acknowledged. What they did during those 30 years was wrong. They will use a catch-all phrase, all killing is wrong. And within that all, they say that's state violence as well as the violence that they were engaged in. But the state had a legitimate right to be involved in the apprehension of terrorists. And so, they've never ever come out and said, we acknowledge our guilt and we are sorry for what we have done. And that's a sticking point for folks that have lost loved ones in the Troubles, because the legacy of the past is one of the issues that they haven't resolved with the peace process.
There's lots more we could talk about, but time is running on. So, Billy, thank you very much indeed for sharing your story. Do take a seat, and we're going to have a look just for a few minutes at some verses in John's Gospel, which you may be sitting on.